All right, pre-calc, let's go ahead and take the second batch of problems here. Let's give them a try. So we'll do the same thing. We're going to pull out what are the values. So A is 2, B is 1, right, because it's 1x. C is going to be a 0, right, because there's nothing inside those parentheses, and D turns out to be 1. So this one thing we know is the amplitude right away is going to be 2. So we can start to make some of those ideas. We're talking about the sine function. So that means it would go through the origin. So I'm going to give just a couple marks here as we go through 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so those look pretty good. So out of my original sine function, here's what would happen. And we'll mark these as, 1 and -1. So we get our original sine idea of what's going to happen. A couple things we want to take a look at then is we've changed the amplitude. So that means it's definitely going to be that. But we also moved the whole thing up 1. Okay, so what I used to have right through the middle here is now going to move up 1. Okay, so we're going to move basically the x-axis. We're going to move it up there. So this should be the middle. So I know I have a starting point here. And based on the amplitude of 2, I need 2, 3. Okay, I'm going to go down 1, 2. So we'll still be able to hit that. My spacing's off a little bit, but we'll start getting the idea. Next thing is we have b is 1. So that means the period is going to stay at 2 pi over 1, which is just 2 pi. So that means I can make my initial marks for spacing 2 pi and pi. So that doesn't change at all. But what I have to do is start to move these. So this first half pi is going to go the whole way up to 3. And then at pi, we're going to be back down to 1. Then at 3 pi over 2, we're going to be here. And at 2 pi, that puts us back on that x equals 1 plane. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to make this thing super tall because we changed the amplitude. Okay. All right, so the other questions we can answer are domain. We could have answered that one from the beginning. That's all real numbers. And then what about the range? Now my range goes down to -1 and the whole way up to 3. So we can answer all those things that happen. So the amplitude is one of those first things we want to take care of. The period, that gives us our 4 markings other than the y-axis. The domain and range, right? So the domain, we're dealing with sine and cosine. So the range, that's going to get changed a little bit by that vertical translations. That's what we want to look out for as we work on these. Right. So the next one, we want to give you a chance to kind of pause it and take a look at what can you do with it yet. So I'm going to fill in A is 1/2. Right, so that's the amplitude. So we're going to take whatever it is and we're going to shrink it down. B turns out to be 1. So that means that our period is still going to be 2 pi. The amplitude is going to be the 1/2. So it's going to be squished. C, nothing going on inside, is 0. So we don't have to worry about that. But D this time is that -2. So we're going to take that x-axis and lower that by -2. Right, so if you have that information, if you want to give it a try, go ahead and pause it now. Or you can just stay with me and we'll deal with it that way. Okay, so here we go with cosine. Remember, cosine would be hitting 1 and starting here. So again, I'm going to use my highlighter as that starting point, the original. So we have an idea of what's happening. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this would be 2 pi. We get pi here. All right, so the original cosine graph would start to reach around and get some of these points just like this. But we have a couple translations to make here. So the next thing I'm going to do is lower all these points by 2. So here's 1, 2. So this is now my starting point. Okay, so we're going to lower this x-axis down to here. So this would be my starting point. And make this -2, -3. But we have one other change here, right? We have the amplitude is squished. So and I'm going to take that, make it 1/2, and get rid of the -1. That means our next point at half pi is going to hit right on this new x-axis. That means at pi, I'm only going to be down to -2.5. So I'll try and express that best I can here and only go back up to the 1/2. Okay, so what I'd like to do is try and keep all those ideas straight and then eventually fix some of those. So domain is all real numbers. The range, right, we thought we were going to drop it to 2, and then we had to squish it on top of that. So it means I'm going to be down at -2.5 and only go up to -1 1/2. So we have the translation down, but then on top of that, we squished it. Okay, so translation down, this is going to move that x-axis, if that helps with that dashed line idea of what we're going to do. All right, next one we have, we'll make a list here. We'll go back to A is 3. Okay, so we know the amplitude is 3. We have B is 2, so that affects the period, right? So that means I need 2 pi over 2, which means the entire graph has to fit within pi. But remember, we're not really going to make too many adjustments to that. C, all right, there's no parentheses, so that's a 0 in there. We're not adding or subtracting, and there's nothing afterwards. So I'm not going to move the x-axis up or down in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so let's get a couple marks on here. So originally, we'd have 1 and -1. Originally, I would have the whole way out to 2 pi. But notice I've already identified the fact that this thing only goes out to pi. So my mid mark is going to be half of that. So 1/2 pi or pi over 2. Then I don't have to worry about those things too much. So this would be my graph. Just looking at that period shift, right? So cosine, we're going to hit, and hit to hit those graphs. But we got some changes here. We got a change order. It has to be super tall. So here's 3, and I have to get myself down to -3. And this whole thing is happening, right? Even though I have the 4 marks, keep in mind this is half of what the original graph would have been. But luckily, we don't have to deal with that too much because we're just going to alter the entire scale so we don't have to bother with it. Okay. But if I use Desmos or graphing utility, I'm going to see this thing has been horizontally squished, right? While it's also being vertically stretched. So we have a couple things happening there. So it's super tall, and we're going to see that kind of float back and forth very quickly. So what else did I not answer? The domain. Getting a little tired of that one, aren't you? The range, we're going to go from -3 to +3, as we didn't do any translation afterwards. So we get to use just those values. All right, so we got a couple left here. You can see why I tried to break this up into 2 different videos. It's pretty intense, but it's good stuff. We can handle it. The A value is 1, so the amplitude is 1. The B value is 2. The C value is -pi. And D, there's nothing afterwards, so D is 0. Okay, so the period is now affected because B was 2, so 2 pi over 2. So we should be able to make that pi. So that means when we make our 4 distinguished marks here, I know it's pi, and it's pi over 2. The amplitude is still going to be 1. Okay, so I'm going to use 1 and -1, trying to get those about the same height. So we have one other change going on here, and that's the fact that it's now been moved negative. So that's to the right. So we're going to move to the right. All right, so the next thing, since we're going to move to the right, we also have this B value included, and this is based on the phase shift, right? So remember what happens here is we want the opposite of C over B. Okay, so that would be +pi over 2. So these things go together. So sine, remember, sine is going to start at the origin, and it's going to kind of loopity-loop here as we work through. So hopefully as you get through these, you're getting a little bit better at drawing them. It gets a little bit easier. You understand where the meeting points are. But here's the difference is my phase shift is now +pi over 2. So this starting point here is now way over here, which means I got to add in some space here. Okay, so we need to put these in. So where are we going to be at? 3 pi over 2 for my ending point. Okay, so let's get started here. Amplitude, nothing changes there. So we start here, trying to hit near that 1, come back down, hit to the -1, and come back up. Okay, so that means the domain, all reals, the range was still -1 to 1. Okay, so we have not only the period change, but also the phase. Okay, so the phase, that's what we're used to as far as left and right. But remember, we have a combination of B and C now. So I'm going to try and list those next to that as we get to those for the next couple. All right, so we got one that you can try here. Again, if you want to pause it, if you think you're good, then go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to roll through it. I'm just going to list some information, give you a chance to pause it if you'd like to. All right, so if you're back, then we can roll from here. The amplitude is 1. The period is 2 pi over 1/2. So that's actually going to be 4 pi. So as I make my 4 marks out here, it's going to take me to 4 pi to get through the whole thing. Okay, so that means this would be 2 pi here. Right, we can put in 3 pi, pi. If you want to list all of them, we can do that. All right, the next thing, the phase shift, right? So because I have multiple of these items going in here, what we're talking about is now negative pi over 2 over top of 1/2. Okay, so this is going to turn out to be negative pi. So remember, the idea is if this is positive, that means we're talking about going left, and then we have a combination here. So we're talking about moving this whole thing left pi units. So I'm talking about negative pi over here as a starting point. Sine would start, right? So here, let me again get the original on here. So we would have this type of shape, but we're going to shift it. So my starting point is now left to negative pi. We're going to come up and hit at 1, come back through at pi, come on down to 2 pi, and finish at 3 pi to get that whole thing. So domain, all reals, the range, -1 to 1. So those are becoming less important because I didn't change the amplitude at all with this problem. We're starting to get the idea of this phase shift. So we have two things happening here. Remember, the period is 2 pi over b, and the phase shift is -c over b. So those are kind of the work throughs that we need to work on as we get through graphing trig functions. All right, so that wraps up part 2, and now you're ready to do some more practice.